Hi guys, welcome to the Art of Server. In today's video, I'm going to show you how to flash this Dell H330 to a IT mode SAS controller. So this is the Dell H330. It uses a LSI SAS 3008 chipset, and there are a couple of variants of this that Dell sells. Most of them are in RAID mode using a MegaRAID equivalent Dell firmware. Dell also sells a variant of this called the HBA 330, which is running IT mode firmware. And so what we're actually going to do today is take the HBA 330 IT mode firmware and put it on the H330. So today's method is actually brought to you by a gentleman that goes by the username Sleyk on ServeTheHome. He was the first person to ever discover a process to do this conversion. And so I'm going to leave a link to his thread on ServeTheHome if you want to get some more details. But the process I'm going to show you today is more or less following what Sleyk showed on his thread, with one or two little modifications that I made. But essentially it is the same process. So all credit for this goes to Sleyk, and he actually reached out to me and asked me to do a video on this to show and share with you guys. So I'm going to go ahead and do that today. I've got a USB drive here with FreeDOS and all the utilities required to do this conversion today that's on this drive, and I'll go into the details of what those files are and what files you need in order to do this in a little bit once we get booted up. But first, let's get this card installed in the server. Okay, and let's get booted up, and on the virtual console I'll show you the rest of the steps. Alright guys, I have the virtual console app pulled up. Let's go ahead and power this machine on. And we'll just give it a few seconds here to boot up. Alright, so we have this thing booted up in FreeDOS right now. And I have the tools that we need in this directory here. Okay, so let me just kind of show you some of the files we have here. So for starters, we have the MegaCli tool, and we're going to use this to extract the SAS address and various other information that's already on the card right now, because we're going to need that after we flash this to IT mode. And in addition to that, there is this MegaRec right here, MegaRec.exe. Now this particular version of MegaRec is, let's see if I can show it here. Yeah. Okay, it's scrolling by too fast and I can't really show you. Well, let's see, can I do ADP list? Okay, so you can see that this is version right over here, 01.02-020, dated August 4th, 2015. You do need this version in order to recognize these newer generation SAS 3 cards. So you need to go find this version of MegaRec and make sure that you have this version or something newer. Previous versions that have been kind of tossed around in the past for flashing the older generation cards will probably not recognize this SAS 3008 controller. So make sure you have this version or newer of MegaRec. Other than that, we're going to need SAS 3 flash, or here, let's yeah, so we're going to need this program to do the firmware flashing at the very end. So that's basically the utilities you need: is MegaCli, MegaRec, and the appropriate version, or the at least the latest version of MegaRec. And you need SAS 3 flash to do the final firmware flash. Alright, so now as far as firmware files are concerned, this is going to be kind of interesting. So let me just kind of show you some of the files that we're going to need here. I think that should show everything we need. Yeah, okay, so yeah, so up here, let's see, let me do this one by one. Where are we? Okay. I'm getting some lag here between the virtual console and my keyboard here. All right, let me just kind of show you the ROM files. So there's the MPT X64, MPT XSAS3 ROM. I believe I'm going to only be using the MPT X64 ROM, and this is basically the LSI ROM for these cards. There's an SMC3108.ROM file. This is actually, so this is where Sleyk kind of had this interesting method, and I don't really know how he came about it, perhaps just experimenting and trying different things. See, this card is hard to work with. Once you kind of run, you flash it with the SMC3108, which it's not a 3108 chipset. It is a 3008 chipset, but it somehow the flashing process will accept the 3108 firmware. And so if you flash this firmware, the card won't work. But by putting it in a state where it doesn't work, actually allows you to override any kind of protections, I guess. And so then you can put on the HBA IT mode firmware. And so this is kind of the secret sauce that Sleyk had figured out how to do here. So that's why we have the SMC3108 ROM file, which is the firmware for the 3108. And we also have this SBR file. So there is the MT448.SBR, and this is basically a 448 bytes of zeros. And the SBRs on these cards are 448 bytes long. It's actually 224 bytes for the primary copy, and then there's another 224 bytes of kind of a secondary backup copy. And so between those two, they're basically identical, but there are two copies of the same thing, and so in total it takes up 448 bytes. And so I'm going to use the MT448.SBR file to basically erase the entire SBR. And that's the step that is a little bit different. Sleyk uses the original 256 byte MT-SBR, which is enough to erase the primary copy, the first copy, and so it still works. But just to be a little bit cleaner, I'm going to go ahead and just delete the entire SBR, all 448 bytes. That includes the primary copy as well as the backup copy. And afterwards, we're just going to update the flash with the HBA firmware, which I have here as HBA 330.FW. Okay, so those are the files you're going to need. You're going to need the 3108 ROM firmware file, which we're going to use to kind of trick the card into going into a bad state that allows us to flash another firmware on it. Then we're going to use the MT448.SBR to completely clear the SBR. And then we're going to flash the HBA 330 firmware as well as the MPT X64 ROM that will basically be the boot ROM basically. Okay, so anyway, to get started, first thing we're going to do is use MegaCli ADP all info-80. I've only got one controller in here, so I know it's going to be 80. And I'm going to save this information into a file. So this will extract all the data from the firmware into a text file, so that includes things like its serial number, the model. In fact, I'll just kind of show you and take a look here. So you'll see that this is a PERC H330 adapter. It has a serial number 958002K, and we'll use that a little later on. It's got the controller ID, link speed. Let's see, somewhere down here. Ah, there we go. And then there's the SAS address. So it starts with the 51866DA 06192EB00. So we're going to need that information later on. So now we've saved that information in this file. So we're good to go there. All right. So at this point, you can't really flash anything to the card using SAS3 flash, it just simply won't recognize this card in this state. And so just to kind of demonstrate that for you, by the way, we'll do a list. So you'll see it says, you know, there's no SAS 3008 adapter found, so we can't flash any firmware to it in this state using the SAS3 flash method. So instead we're going to use MegaCli, and we're going to do ADP FW flash -F no ver check. Okay, so here we're going to use the MegaCli. So we know the MegaCli utility can communicate with this card in its current state where it has the MegaRAID firmware. We're going to use that to flash a new firmware onto that card, and this is actually the wrong firmware. It's a firmware for 3108 that should not be on this card. So I don't know if you could flash something else that will kind of do the same trick, because basically we're trying to make the card dysfunctional. And so yeah, so anyway, we're going to use the ADP FW flash command, and we're going to give it the file smc3108.rom, and we're going to specify no version check, because we know this is not the appropriate version and all that stuff. So we don't want it to actually check that. Otherwise it'll probably bomb out before it'll do anything. And then -A0 basically just picks that particular controller. Now if you have more than one controller in the system, you're going to have to be very careful about picking the right controller. I usually recommend, if you're doing this for the first time and you're not that familiar, it's best to just pull out any other controllers that are in the system and just work on the one controller that's in the system. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and do this. Okay, so it says flash complete, please reboot the system. And so at this point, we're going to reboot the system. But here's the interesting part. The card's not going to work, because this is the wrong firmware for this card. And we're actually going to let it fault out. And you'll see that in a second here when I reboot the machine. But by doing so, I guess it puts a card in a state that's kind of open, and will allow us to use the MegaRec utility and the SAS3 flash utility later on. So alright, so let's go ahead and reboot. This reboot is going to take a little bit of time, because it's going to try to communicate with the card, and the card's going to be kind of wigging out and not behaving correctly, but at some point it'll pass that. And so let's just go ahead and reboot here. Okay, so here you're going to see that the ROM is being loaded from the card, and it's really going to struggle here. And you have to be very patient. It's going to take somewhere around 3 to 4 minutes for this to kind of get past itself. So just be patient and wait for this to kind of time out. Okay, so here you'll see adapter at baseboard is not responding, no adapter. So that's the message you're waiting for. Once it gets past that, the system will just continue to boot as usual. Alright, so now we're back in FreeDOS again. So let's go ahead and get back into my working directory where I have all those files that I showed you earlier. And at this point, we're going to use the MegaRec tool to write the SBR with the 448 bytes of zeros. Okay, so the command is MegaRec -write SBR 0 mt448.sbr, and you'll see this error message. It says real mode interrupt vector has been modified. That's expected. Okay, and at this point we're also going to clear the flash. So basically we're going to erase the flash, and so we're going to do MegaRec -clean flash 0. And by the way, this 0 is an index number to that particular card. So if there were 3 cards, it would be 0, 1, 2. You have to pick their appropriate index number to address that particular card. So we're going to go ahead and do the clean flash, which will erase the flash on that card. Alright, so that's it, and at this point we're going to have to reboot again. And so now the card is in the state where it has a cleared SBR and it has no firmware, and so it doesn't have anything. But once we reboot, SAS3 Flash will recognize this card. It will notice that it doesn't have any firmware, and it'll ask you to it'll prompt you to load a firmware for it. But we're actually going to just go ahead and pick a firmware and ROM to flash it with. So let's go ahead and reboot. Alright, so we're rebooted again back into FreeDOS. Okay, so at this point we're going to go ahead and flash the IT mode firmware. And so to do that, we're going to use the SAS3 Flash utility, and I'm just going to specify -O for the advanced options. I'm not really sure if we need that, but anyway. So the firmware is HBA 330.fw, and the BIOS is the mptx64.rom. And so let's go ahead and do this. Alright, so the flashing is done, and at this point we're missing basically the SAS address and that type of information, but remember we saved that with the MegaCli tool in the beginning, so let's just pull that information out. I'm also going to look for the serial number. So I had that in the H330 info.txt file. Okay, so there's the information that we need, and we're going to do SAS3 Flash again, and there's only one adapter, so I'll do -C0 -O -SAS add. So let's enter the 51866DA06192EB00, and I'm also going to add the serial number as the tracer number. So that is 958002K. Alright. Okie dokie. So at this point, if we do a SAS3 Flash -list, we should see the card in all its IT mode glory. Alright, there you have it, guys. So that is now recognized as a HBA 330 adapter instead of the H330 MegaRAID card. And you can see it has IT mode firmware version 16.00.08.00, which is not exactly the latest relative to what LSI or Broadcom has released, but it's close enough. I think the latest from Broadcom is 16.0.10.0. But anyway, I do actually personally prefer running this Dell firmware instead of like the kind of the original LSI firmware, and there's a couple of reasons for that. When you run the original LSI firmware, there's a couple of things that don't exactly integrate well with the Dell server, and I showed you guys this back when I was showing how I got a H310 mini and H710 mini flash for the 12th generation Dell servers. And one of the consequences of doing that, and although the IT mode stuff works great, for example, the status LED for the hard drives don't always work as expected. I think with SAS drives, the status LED is always on, and with SATA drives, it's always off. The activity LED still works fine. It does flicker with activity, so that part works okay. But there are just a little bit, kind of a few quirks there that you run into when you're mixing the LSI original firmware with Dell, kind of the Dell hardware. So in this case, using the HBA 330 firmware, which is kind of Dell's version of the IT mode firmware, it will allow it to work normally with all the status LEDs and everything working kind of as expected. So I actually kind of prefer that. And so anyway, this is it. We've got this card now running with the HBA 330 firmware, so it is a true IT mode card. Now, all that said, the MegaRAID firmware, the original H330 firmware, okay, does have a HBA mode, and you can launch the BIOS setup utility for the card, the BIOS ROM program for the card, and go into the menu system, and there's a section where you can modify the personality of the card to HBA mode. And so you can kind of accomplish the same thing by just simply doing that instead of this kind of complicated procedure. But you know, some people prefer just to kind of keep it pure with IT mode firmware, and so if that's what you want to do, this is how you do it. And I do want to point out one thing though. If you instead keep the MegaRAID firmware and just turn on the HBA mode of that firmware, at least in Linux, it doesn't load the MPT3 driver, which is what the IT mode firmware would normally load. Instead, it still loads the MegaSAS driver, which is kind of the MegaRAID driver, but it still acts as a kind of a HBA mode adapter. It just uses a different driver, and so in some situations that could be a problem. I think in particular with FreeNAS, the drivers are maybe not as mature, and so certain functionality missing. So I don't know about this particular card, but I think I showed you guys in the past about like smart data. The hardware supports the smart data, whether it's in RAID or IT mode, it doesn't really matter. The hardware allows you to extract the smart data off the hard drives so long as they have smart data on hard drives. But certain drivers don't allow that to work in the FreeBSD or FreeNAS world. And so you might run into that, and chances are if you are running kind of the pure IT mode firmware, you'll have less likelihood of running into those kind of problems. But in the Linux world, it doesn't really matter that much. If you are running the MegaRAID firmware in HBA mode, it is kind of more or less the same as running it in IT mode, and you'll still be able to see the smart data off the drives in both cases. So anyway, that's it, guys. Hope that was helpful to you guys. If anybody is trying to do this, hope this video helps you out. It's not exactly complicated, but there's kind of a little trick there involved with the 3108 firmware. And once again, thank you very much, Sleyk, for sharing this trick with all of us and reaching out to me and asking me to make this video. I think my audience was going to love it, so thank you very much for that. So anyway, thanks and have a nice day, guys. Bye bye.